Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar, all the more so as it not only celebrates a very fine piece of work, but the RAI Urgent Anthropology Programme. And I should just explain very briefly what that's about, which is the late George Appel approached us already now a good 25 or 30 years ago and suggested that we should try to encourage research in areas where cultures were under threat. And of course, now we can see so clearly that he's absolutely right. And although these issues are extremely complex, there is an underlying problem that the interaction of Indigenous peoples in conservation and development is still very, very unequal. And we just had a large conference discussing this on anthropology and conservation at the RAI. And as we were listening to that conference, I was very, very clear in my mind that George Appel's original vision for this research, which he himself largely funded, is absolutely borne out by events. And so we really do have to pay tribute to his memory. So thank you, George. Well, moving on then to today's event, we are very, very proud to be able to welcome Professor Susan Crate from George Mason University, who's sharing her research with us before it's even been published, although it's about to be published shortly in a book. And the title of her work is Once Upon the Permafrost, Knowing Culture and Climate Change in Siberia. Now, the format of today's event is not only to feature Susan Crate's work, and we'll have plenty of time to discuss it, but also to go back to the holders of the Urgent Anthropology Programme at the British Museum, who would like to talk very, very briefly about it. And here I should just say how very, very grateful we have been since the foundation of the RAI to be able to work with the British Museum. Although it's a little bit like comparing a flea with an elephant in terms of our mutual size, we really have had the closest and cordial relations since the early 19th century with them. And it was very, very good that we could once more work together so well. So just for now then, I'm very pleased to introduce Amber Lincoln and Lissant Bolton from the BM, who will say a few words before we continue with our program. So please, Amber and Lissant, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Susan. Hello, David. I'm Lissant Bolton. I'm the keeper of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the British Museum. And I'm just here very briefly because we were so grateful to the RAI and to George Appel and his family for the Urgent Anthropology Fellowships that we were able to apply to our Arctic program, which Amber's going to talk about just in 2 seconds. But we're so grateful for that vision and that generosity and that support, because it enabled us to give 2 fellowships, one of which was to Susan, to support field research. And I am so committed to the importance of field research in anthropology, more and more committed as the decades go by, rather than less and less. It seems so essential. And as David said, there is so much that is changing in the world, and it's good to know what it is and to support people as they try and deal with that. So I'm going to introduce Amber Lincoln, who until recently was a curator for the Americas in the British Museum in the department, and who we bitterly regret, but who's moved on. But she was leading on this project, so I'm going to ask Amber to speak now and say thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lissant. Yes, it's good to be with you all, and I'm sort of joining you from Berkeley, California, the ancestral homelands of the Wichan Ohlone people. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Susie and I guess her editor, Tracy Hetherington. And I want to thank RAI for organizing this event. And just to mirror Lissant's comments and express my own gratitude for the RAI and the Urgent Anthropology Program, which in this instance helped fund Susan Crate's exciting work that we're going to learn about. And part of her research included spending time at the British Museum with me, going through the Indigenous collections from Russia. And not only did you know, her knowledge and her network of contacts, you know, contribute to the long-term documentation of those collections. But it also educated me and other curators about the culturally specific ways that the Sakha are experiencing and understanding climate change. And this was really essential information to the city exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate, which was up in the autumn of 2020, and since has we've created a 360, and I'll flip through just a little bit just to give you a sense of that toward the end of my talk. But you know, that exhibition, curated by myself, Peter Louvers, and Jago Cooper, was you know, quite a learning experience, and it was essential information from people like Susie where we were able to bring so many different perspectives from the Arctic into one exhibition. So, as Susan Crate has argued so cogently in her work and demonstrated in Once Upon a Permafrost, changes to the climate throughout the world are understood culturally. And really it's this, this cultural lens that people explain and are influenced by these, by the changes that they're experiencing. And what changes minds, what really gets into, you know, what really helps people understand is not necessarily the scientific data, although that helps, but narrative and storytelling. And museums really have a role to play in this, because museums can highlight, you know, this specific cultural information from scholars like Susie, from Indigenous partners throughout the world, and bring it into exhibition. And museum exhibitions can be great storytellers. They can be a great way to bring the sort of the empathy and the narrative storytelling to the general public. And so we have this challenge where we're dealing with this pervasive worldwide challenge of global climate change. We've just seen you know, many leaders converge on Glasgow for COP26. But the challenge I think that we all have to address is sort of getting past these the pervasive, often too binary debates of climate change that tend to come out of urban centers, you know, such as London or New York. These sort of causes and drivers and responses and blame or lack of response. So I think museums in particular, great ethnography, can bring the subtlety and the cultural specific information to light. So, and in Arctic culture and climate, and I'm gonna try to chew gum and walk at the same time. I'm gonna share my screen and just flip through this so that you can, you know, get a chance to, you know, you can look at it at your own pace another time. But we really tried to bring out Indigenous perspectives of climate change and experiences of climate change by focusing on weather and how Indigenous Arctic people understand and use weather, not something that you brace against, but in fact as a tool. And you know, frozen precipitation is travel, it's access to bountiful lands, and it's the way to process food, it's building material. So that was one way that we really tried to focus and bring these Indigenous perspectives.
Whoops, did we lose Amber?
I think we might have lost Amber a moment. She might try and rejoin, otherwise so just.
Yeah, it looks like Amber is gone from the list of people in the meeting, so she will have.
She might have hit the wrong button when she thought she was stopping sharing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So
well, not to worry. Why don't we just carry on and then welcome Amber back? That would be the best thing, because we don't know whether the break is a permanent one, let's hope not, or a temporary one. So the next part of our program is to welcome Tracy Hetherington, who was the editor of this work, or oversaw it largely. So if Heather's here, she would very likely, please do come to the fore. I'm sure Hanyin is sorting that out now. And Tracy, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be here and to be one of the very first people to sing the praises of this fantastic book. I should say that I am coming first from the West Coast, from Vancouver, from the incredibly beautiful homelands of the Musqueam people, where I'm very privileged to be here. We're located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Musqueam. I'm also here on behalf of the Critical Green Engagements series, in which Susie's fantastic book is coming out. And the series is basically a critical perspective on the political economy of conservation and sustainability and climate change. The books in our series draw on rich ethnographic research to highlight problems with neoliberal approaches to conservation, sustainability, and the challenges of the Anthropocene. So I've actually been a fan of Susie's work since, well, for many years I've been teaching a class on globalization, culture, and environment. And so of course I've been using Susie's wonderful co-edited volume on the anthropology and climate change as a course text. And one of the very important things about that book is that it really enables students to engage with a wide range of case studies that bring ethnographic insights to understand exactly what climate change means to real people on the ground. Susie was also a very important contributor on the American Anthropological Association's statement on humanity and climate change in 2015. And I want to remark that the way that the work that was done by that group has been absolutely vital in affirming a clear role for anthropology in the interdisciplinary projects that have to be undertaken in order to understand what climate change actually is, namely a human problem, and also how we should address it, and in a word, together. And together means bridging not only disciplinary divides, but also language divides and very different ways of knowing and being the world. So I've been incredibly, incredibly excited to be one of the first to see the culmination of Susie's long-term work. Her research on culture and ecology in Siberia, and her very important exploration of how ecological changes are manifested and experienced within the context of the life projects of Sakha people in Siberia. And as parts of the Siberian permafrost thaw, many Sakha live in an increasingly precarious environment, and yet the subtle ongoing changes have happened so slowly that they're almost overlooked amid evidence of the far more dramatic effects that are usually recognized as part of the climate emergency. So this subtle, uncertain, but ongoing losses and transformations of the Alas reflect a larger reality of global climate change that, as Susie says, we all live on permafrost. So let me just say a few words about why I find this book so very special with regards to our own series. There are actually two very important threads of parallel research and reflexivity that are going on in this book. And the first, of course, is Susie's incredible longitudinal ethnography in Siberia, research that's deeply informed both by knowledge making and world making of the Sakha, and by Susie's research collaboration with Alexander Nikolaevich. Sasha, I'm going to call him Sasha from now on because I'm not sure I've got this quite right. But in any case, a natural science from the Melnikov Permafrost Institute. So in this context, Susie is helping us understand the ontological gaps that produce very different understandings of the living physical and cultural landscape in Siberia, the Alas, and how Sakha himself worked with her to try and bridge that gap. Susie shows us that landscape through the effective words of Sakha poets, through the life histories of her friends and acquaintances, through visual anthropology, through meticulous attention to their concerns and interests, their language and spirituality over the years. So she tells us, for example, on page 243, the meaning of Alas for Sakha is integrative and includes the entire complex of physical, social, cultural, and cosmological attributes. So this is really at the heart of an effort to decolonize climate science and establish Indigenous worlds at the very center of knowledge making. So when she tells us that the Alas and permafrost are the cultural keystones of Sakha identity and resilience, she's also recognizing the Sakha as key protagonists in their own future. She also helps us to understand how climate change impacts entangle with social and demographic transitions to induce rapid changes in the landscape. In this case, how youth outmigration and economic globalization contributed to the complexity of environmental change, so that we understand climate change is deeply intertwined with so many other transformations, such as urbanization and the impacts of social media adoption on language practices. So it's never just a simple physical process on its own. And you know, it's surprisingly hard to get that across to people. It seems like a simple, straightforward idea, but it requires this kind of really nuanced, rich case study of the kind that Susie has done to really make it stand out. So I was saying that there are two very important threads of parallel research and reflexivity going on in the book. The second part of this, and I hope that this will not be recognized or underappreciated. The second is Susie's very important ethnography of climate science itself, which is placed in dialogue with the rest of her ethnography. In fact, we have this really important reflection on the career of a very important environmental anthropologist in our midst. So it's important work of intellectual history as well. Now, this is partly about the detailed account of her efforts of community-based research and science communication together with Sakha, particularly in chapter 7. It's also in part an exploration of how natural scientists define concepts around the physical science of climate change, and kind of an autoethnography around the public work of climate science at the international level. Particularly her participation in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, special report on oceans and the cryosphere in 2018. And we coaxed Susie to include some of this, particularly in the introductory chapter. And I think it's such an important contribution, not only to environmental anthropology, but to the history of anthropology. So I want to, with Susie's permission, I just want to read a tiny bit of this because it's fabulous, fabulous work. Let's see if I can get that right.
Sure. You have my permission.
What was that?
You have my permission.
Thank you, Susie. Like you're going to stop me. Okay. All right. I'm on page 11 of a book that you all soon see. I'm so excited about this. She says, so she gets to this, to the IPCC, right? She's one of the very first anthropologists to be included in a process like this. And she says, my heart sank during our chapter team's first meeting. We began by sharing our expertise around the table. After several others had explained their work in oceanography or satellite data or cryosphere science, I introduced myself as an anthropologist who conducted longitudinal ethnographic research in northeastern Siberia. The faces around the table went blank. I began to worry. With a few more introductions, my worry abated. One person on the team worked on community health issues with Indigenous populations in the Arctic, and another on socio-environmental issues with communities in South Asia. The three of us huddled together during the first coffee break to share ideas and strategies to educate the rest of our chapter team on Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. Over the course of the week, we each proposed to the group different ways to bring the relevance of knowledge systems other than science into the report's framing. It was a hard sell. Many of our colleagues were polite. Others were outspoken, doubting that our contribution was necessary. Nevertheless, by the end of the week, we had gotten a place in the chapter outline, quote, knowledge systems for understanding and responding to climate change, or to change. And now we had to draft it. By the time we met again, something amazing had happened. It was like night and day. Our interactions with our chapter colleagues during that second team meeting were qualitatively different compared to the first week. Everyone on the chapter team had bought into our section. Perhaps it was the group work on the Google Doc over the interim 6-month period and the process of group editing and feedback throughout. Instead of considering a knowledge system section at arm's length, many engaged directly in our discussions, commenting on how they were seeing the importance of knowledge systems for their own work and for the report overall. We knew we had made our case when the one scientist who had expressed the most hesitancy in our first meeting actually vouched for the importance of including knowledge systems in the report during a larger plenary session. Nevertheless, the 2-year process continued to challenge our 3-person team. We had to repeatedly make the case for the knowledge systems section to the lead authors of the report's other 5 chapters. But the time also enabled us to include holders of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge as contributing authors. That the IPCC had yet to invite holders of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge as lead authors was and remains a major oversight. We did our best to crack that door open by engaging them as much as we could. And I'll zip down a little bit. Perhaps the biggest challenge was how to name these knowledge systems. The term scientific knowledge was first up to critique. For critique, our contributing authors, Indigenous knowledge holders, objected to referring to what we know as science with the term scientific knowledge, arguing our Indigenous knowledge has developed over generations. It is time-tested and empirical. It is also science. They explored with us different ways to name scientific knowledge, Western scientific knowledge or elite scientific knowledge, but both failed to make an accurate differentiation. It goes on. Whoops, I've lost my notes. Okay. Skipping down to page 13. Early feedback suggested we depict Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge as complementing scientific knowledge. We rejected this idea, explaining that each knowledge system had standing in its own right. The task is not to quantify other ontologies to fit into prescribed scientific categories to make generalizable arguments, but rather to let each contribute its unique elements. In turn, this process renders many of the prescribed technocratic frameworks of climate science, for example, adaptation, resilience, and vulnerability, or ARV, useless. But that is the point here. Including the diversity of ways to understand and act in the world cannot be understood by scientifically determined frameworks. How could an ARV frame account for the cosmological and spiritual importance of a loss and its central place in Sakha cultural identification? We need new inclusive frames of reference. In the end, we represented 3 knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and scientific knowledge as equals, each along with their individual trajectories of development and change over time, and each coming into contact to intermingle with the others in specific context. So while the IPCC process has been criticized for affirming neoliberal orientations toward climate change and the separation of nature from the human context, Sakha perspectives that Susie presents to us in this book give us a different way of approaching changing climates. So the book actually enables us to consider the tensions between cultural orientations embedded in global scientific narratives around climate change in permafrost regions versus indigenous knowledge systems and affective orientations woven together through the Alas, and above all by Sakha people's own visions and strategies for resilience, suggesting a very important critique of neoliberal visions of nature. So I'll just end with a comment that really stood out by one of the manuscript reviewers that I think really encapsulates our excitement about this. They said, "This monograph will be an enduring contribution to the literature. It contains such vital and rare ethnographic content that it will be required reading for any anthropologists working in the area. It will furthermore have resonance and could be a critical resource for scholars generally interested in the North, the Arctic, climate change, the cryosphere, and permafrost." So thank you, Susie, for taking all the time you did to put this together. I think, you know, the process itself was incredible, and I'm so proud to have been cheering you on in the background. Congratulations.
Thank you. Feeling is mutual.
Well, thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. Now, Amber, is your computer working again?
Yes, sorry about that. We don't need to, you know, elongate this. I was simply, Tracy mentioned so many things that were, you know, I was going to mention it just about some connections with, you know, the idea of climate change being understood within larger processes of colonialism, and the changes that people are experiencing today are often understood by Indigenous Arctic people as, you know, part of the wider changes to disruptions to the environment, you know, caused by imperialism, expansion, settlement, forced conversion, residential schools. So I want to thank Susie for her work and her contribution to just the Arctic exhibition. And I will just leave it at that. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it, Susie, and great. That was a great introduction, Tracy. So thank you for that. I will pass it on.
Well, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. And I can share with you that indeed during the introduction, my computer crashed twice as well. So perhaps there is something in the atmosphere which is yes causing us.
I think it was too much. It was too much the sharing the 360 tour. I think kind of overtaxed.
I see. Well, anyway, well, thank you very much, everybody. We really laid the ground beautifully. So please, Susan, the floor is yours, and we look forward enormously to hearing more about this wonderful work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Amber. I only regret that I could not get to the exhibit in person, but such is life, I guess, in a pandemic. I want to first express my sincere gratitude to the Royal Anthropological Institute, namely David Shanklin and Lissant, Lissant is with the British Museum, Haneen, Catherine, and everyone else there who made my work possible. Also, of course, to Amber at the British Museum and Lissant, and then also to Tracy and the whole team at the University of Arizona Press. This has really been quite a wonderful ride for me. I feel very, very excited about this book. And of course, I acknowledge and identify all of the people who have contributed, many too many to name here by name, but I also lastly want to acknowledge that George Mason is built on the indigenous homes, the indigenous homelands of the Manahoac people. And with no further ado, I will share my screen and begin to tell you about the book itself. As you read this song text, notice the sense of longing it sings about in Alas, a place of deep cultural meaning for Sakha. Anastasia Varlamova wrote this song based on her own life, living near her family's Alas. Here is a second song text of Longing for Alas. This one written by Baibal Pavel Semyonov. He's of the generation after Varlamova who spent little time on his family's Alas. Nonetheless, the images and sensory depictions relay a similar longing for and attachment to Alas. What is Alas? According to Pekarsky, a Polish ethnographer exiled to Siberia who was fluent in Sakha based on his life with the Sakha, wrote this definition. His definition continues with a myriad of colloquialisms, common expressions, Alas types, and proverbs, toponyms, and a riddle, all which clarify how for Sakha, Alas is much more than a physical place. Through ethnographic research, I brought forth the multidimensional meaning of Alas for Sakha. Now so much comes clear to me in retrospect. The sacred flight of swans at the 1992 festival, which signified the ancestors returning to their birth Alas. The Minister of Culture's insistence of walking the circumference of his birth Alas before departing in the helicopter. The understanding of how Sakha lived by the Alas in family clan units prior to the collectivization of the Soviet period. As my understanding of the sacred Alas grew, I began asking inhabitants about it. These articulations cast the Alas as an otherworldly place imbued with lush, abundant, and vibrant nature. Yes, Alas is a physical place, but it is also a sacred vow with the ancestors, an entangled, interdependent set of relationships between human and non-human animals, plants, lakes, glades, and spirits. In the last few years, I have begun to hear different depictions. Because Alas are underlain by a type of permafrost that is ice-filled, which is rapidly thawing due to climate change, Alas are transforming before Sakha's eyes. And inhabitants are taking notice. Because of their intimate knowledge of their homelands, they see how the once flat lands in the outlying areas are transforming. Regional scientists are also taking note, and the thermokarst development is especially pronounced on the former fields of the state farms. Thermokarst is the term for the above ground phenomenon you see here, the land appearing to be bubbled as the permafrost below it thaws. The international permafrost community is also paying attention, here using the 1990 to 2000 changes in permafrost temperatures across Eurasia to project thaw for 2040 to 2050, and then for 2090 to 2100. And the international media has also begun to tell the world about this transformation. However, the spiritual and the cultural meaning of Alas for Sakha are missing from the science and the media. This is my inspiration for Once Upon the Permafrost. Overall, I argue that we need all relevant knowledge systems to begin to tackle the issue of rapid permafrost thaw and climate change overall. I use ethnography to show Sakha and Alas as a case in point. I will give you a brief overview of the book in this presentation, but first some geographical and cultural orientation. Here is Russia with the Sakha Republic in close-up. Sakha's Turkic ancestors migrated from Central Asia around 900 AD, then north along the Lena River in the Genghis Khan period over 500 years ago to settle in the Sakha areas. There are two main Sakha enclaves. One is in the central regions. The arrow is actually pointing to the Vilui regions I was trying to show you. Here are the central regions, if you can see my mouse, and the second enclave in the Vilui regions. This is the place of my research in the villages of Kutana and Algay. The ecosystem is boreal forest or taiga dotted by alas, cryogenic lakes surrounded by hay fields that transition to forest. Sakha adapted their horse and cattle subsistence to this extreme continental climate. Beyond their physical adaptations, Sakha's historical cosmology ascribes all of the world as sentient. The rocks, trees, water, land, alas, everything requires proper interactions and relations to be successful. In chapter 1, I explore Sakha's indigenous knowledge of permafrost. One example here is the balus, an underground freezer that utilizes the permafrost. Early colonizers documented Sakha's use of it. To this day, Sakha have used balus, but now less and less as the permafrost thaws. Abandoned balus entryways are seen often in the villages. This image struck me as I made my way home one day after a day of fieldwork to my hosts. How the juxtaposition of the abandoned balus and the modern school visually depicts the rapid change occurring in these rural settlements. A second example of permafrost knowledge is tar, a soured milk concoction that took up nutrients from leftover and waste foods, and also by utilizing the cold to preserve it through the winter months. Sakha's linguistic heritage contains clues of long-term permafrost knowledge. Here are some of the words Sakha used to designate the cycles of permafrost conditions. These words are the lingua franca of contemporary international permafrost science. In this first chapter, I also document the more recent history of scientific permafrost knowledge. In chapter 2, I explore Sakha's indigenous knowledge of alas. Historically, Sakha moved between a winter and a summer home, or saylik. When first arriving at their saylik, Sakha performed the Salama Iyahana ritual, or the hanging of the Salama. Members hung a Salama, lit a fire, and fed their best foods to Wat Ichite, the spirit protector of the fire, while one member sang an algis, or sacred words. Salama is a braided horsehair rope with cloth strips and birch figurines. It is a gift to the sky deities, and an invitation for them to visit the middle world and to be present. Another adaptation to alas were Sakha's pasture making practices. One of their several approaches was to drain an existing lake to use the land. This was a complex and dangerous process. It involved expert knowledge of the land and the heavy work of canal digging. But first and foremost, it required spiritual intervention. The draining of an alas lake involved appeasing the spirit of the lake with the proper words, sacrificial foodstuffs, rituals, and blessings. Once the proper rituals were performed, the work involved the digging of canals from the existing lake to adjacent waterways in order to drain the area. In chapter 2, I also document the more recent history of scientific alas knowledge. If we consider the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge of both permafrost and of alas, it is clear that one knowledge system was developed for subsistence survival and is integral to a people's belief that is rich in cultural history, depth, and meaning, while the other knowledge system is focused on specific physical technicalities and developed for economic and development purposes. In chapter 3, I begin the exploration at the local level, working in my two base villages, Elgay and Kutana, where I've conducted research since 1992. I dedicate chapters 3 to 5 to contemporary ethnography in Elgay and Kutana. I soon discovered that each village had what some referred to as their own Alasni patriot. In Elgay, it was Ivan Gerasimovich Ivanov, known by the pen name Ivan Noller, who dedicated his life to writing about Sakha and Alas. And in Kutana, it was Nikolai Inokentievich Ivanov, known as Kola Ututo, but more about both of them later. Elgay is also home to a village museum called Toydach Alas, which literally means clayey Alas. Here are two of the 4 maps that greet you at the entrance, showing how pre-Soviet Elgay inhabitants lived by the Alas. In chapter 3, I document how local and regional histories, especially the collectivization of the Soviet period, and how local personalities shaped and continue to shape these two settlements to this day. Chapter 4 gives insights to how contemporary inhabitants understand change in their lives in its many forms. I began by soliciting understandings of historical change. Another of the other changes, we see how climate change is challenging Sakha's particular adaptation to their extreme environment. But integral to understanding the changes due to climate alterations is integrating other drivers. For example, encapsulated in this quote, we see how inhabitants are haying less and less as they discontinue keeping cows, a process due to the economic globalization of their rural areas. One of the more pronounced observations inhabitants shared was that of local permafrost thaw. I heard several testimonies and asked if somebody could show me. They're talking about how flat this area used to be. There was a road through the middle. And now we'll hear some English.
Permafrost under that has melted. That's why the holes appear.
So the father had not been there for a long time. The son goes here often. Oh, completely broken. I haven't come here since long ago. Oh, used to be so flat. Look at this, it's like a huge canal. Lots of mosquitoes too, you probably noticed. In chapter 5, I explore in-depth life histories of 12 inhabitants who possess some expertise. I begin with one of the more profound life histories for me. Snow is a horse's home. When I began documenting Valerian's life history, a professional horse breeder, I learned the intimate connection horse breeding has to Sakha's extreme ecosystem. Each meeting since then, he has repeated the same mantra to me, Har Silgijiyate, or snow is horse's home. In addition to the importance of the right amount of snow and weather conditions, another key to survival for horses is kencheri, the grass that grows after the July hay harvest. Kencheri stays green under the snow, and this is what the horses dig for. Before climate change, kencheri could be found all winter, but now it rarely grows due to climate change effects. Another of the 12 life histories was of Maria, or Marusa, Likinova Ivanova. She brought the idea of tar to life for me with her detailed description of making tar in her youth. Marusa praised tar's health-sustaining qualities. She could not recall many instances of colds or other sicknesses, even though back then they went barefoot from the spring melt until the first snowfall in autumn. I was asking Marusa how the seasons had changed over her lifetime. In that interchange, she taught me one of Sakha's pre-technology adaptations. She remarked about the difference in winter temperatures by saying that she no longer heard the sound of cold. Other life histories include a fisher with refined weather observation skills, a lifelong hunter, and many others. The chapter culminates with the life history through the eyes of his daughters of the local Alasni patriot I mentioned earlier, Nikolai Innokentyevich Ivanov, a man who, despite the Soviet period push to erase Sakha understandings and belief, dedicated his life to documenting historical inhabitants of local Alas. He painstakingly documented inhabitants' knowledge of their ancestral lineages and the exact locations of their ancestral Alas. Part of his work included teaching the Kutana school children about Alas, leading field trips to the Alas, and teaching not only the ancestral history of each, but also how to observe changes in the Alas. His daughters made a point to say that it was because of his crystal clear penmanship that they were able to transcribe his work and print the 2 books. These 3 chapters drive home the deep understandings and continued commitments Sakha have to Alas. A quote from the book: "This intimate indigenous knowledge is critical to the bigger picture of how longitudinal ethnographic findings matter. They provide the inroad to understanding how the complex global drivers of change are coming into and affecting not only the physical world of Vilui Sakha, but also their cultural and spiritual worlds, their ability to continue, albeit in a more virtual form today, to live by the Alas. Likewise, they also make clear the important role of engaging scientific knowledge of changing permafrost and Alas in concert with these local understandings, ultimately ushering in the necessary innovations and adaptations for the future is about the ability to engage all available knowledge systems." Chapter 6 focuses on my work with Alexander Fyodorov, permafrost scientist at the Melnikov Permafrost Institute in Yakutsk. I have collaborated with Alexander since 2005. We conducted knowledge exchanges with the local communities of 8 settlements on the Vilui in 2010. I begin by discussing his deep concern for the pace of permafrost thaw in the last few years. This prompted me to request a field trip to the central regions where Alexander's work has largely focused. We did so in the winter of 2018. I had been to the central regions a decade or more before. This time I was shocked to see this thermokarst development as we traveled to the site. We conducted knowledge exchanges in 2 settlements and found opinions very similar to those in Elgay and Kutana. One story Alexander shared I found particularly important in terms of inhabitants' determination to stay in their homelands, despite the increasingly profound thermokarst development. He had developed a plan for one settlement that was situated near lands that were not underlain by ice-filled permafrost, depicted here on this map as the blue areas. Alexander encouraged inhabitants to establish 10 or so homesteads for young families so they could begin the transition and not end up in dangerous conditions as the Alas continued to fail. Following his lengthy explanation and detailed research on the topic, they thanked him and they said they would remember his idea in the future, but for now they would stay where they were. It is also in chapter 6 that I explore Alas as a cultural keystone, a designation attributed to an ecosystem feature that represents cultural significance like Alas does for Sakha. Chapter 7 brings this focus in the very local ethnographic present into global significance through descriptions of other research projects and how Sakha's story of ice dependence is shared across the Arctic and other ecosystems. My work in Mongolia shows how, although the permafrost there is discontinuous and perhaps not such a prominent feature as in Sakha, it nonetheless is critical to maintaining the grasslands that herders depend upon. During the dry months, the permafrost literally waters the grasslands above it. In Nunatsiavut, Labrador, my research shows how the communities there are also ice dependent. Inhabitants depend on the Sheena, or ice edge, where they hunt seals and other sea mammals and also fish. However, in the last decades, the ice is not there as it used to be. On the Chesapeake Bay, watermen are observing increasing sea levels that are due in part to the thawing of the Earth's cryosphere, the permafrost, and glaciers of the world. A similar story of sea level rise is found in Kiribati, an island nation in the South Pacific. And lastly, in Peru, communities are impacted by the rapidly shrinking glaciers for which they depend solely upon for their agriculture and other uses. In all of these research contexts, I had the opportunity to understand how communities have adapted and continue to adapt based on their indigenous and local knowledge. Botanist and indigenous scholar Robin Wall Kimmerer offers her reflections on the matter in Braiding Sweetgrass. She contemplates the energetic reciprocity between the complementary colors of purple asters and goldenrod. She challenges us to consider the complementarity of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge in the same respect. Here is a visual depiction I helped to create for the 2019 IPCC special report that Tracy so perfectly mentioned in her introduction. While you take it in, I share a book excerpt. Changing how scientists and policymakers consider local knowledge and indigenous knowledge is but one step of many that are needed to relinquish the hegemony of science toward a more inclusive world. In my work, this means translating other ways of knowing the environment into a form that makes sense to scientists, policymakers, and the wider public. Ultimately, my goal is challenging the hegemony of scientific knowledge and neoliberal solutions to climate change by bringing to light the depth and breadth of different ways of knowing the world. My central tenet: we need to engage all relevant knowledge systems to find enduring solutions to our shared predicament. This includes revaluing and repatriating indigenous knowledge and local knowledge systems, both through policy changes and activism, within a world from which they were systematically disqualified and subjugated. The planet is one interdependent biosphere and a dynamic and interacting ethnosphere, the sum total of all the thoughts, dreams, ideals, myths, intuitions, and inspirations brought into being by the imagination since the dawn of consciousness, humanity's greatest legacy, all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as the wildly curious and adaptive species we are. Those words by Wade Davis. Our human planet is a systematic patchwork of culturally diverse ways that humans have interacted with their environment and each other and innovated to adapt to change over time, both deep and recent. The direct and enduring interdependencies between our planet's patchwork of biological and cultural systems means that permafrost's demise is in all of our backyards. Permafrost provides one of the main structural foundations for Arctic ecosystems, which in turn work with the other planet's ecosystems to maintain planetary balance. In short, we all live on permafrost. Therefore, its loss matters to us all. Mahtana bin, thank you. and I'm happy to discuss.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that was a beautiful presentation, and I think I can say for all of us a profoundly moving one. And it shows us once more just how much one can offer, I think, if one takes the trouble to have a sustained engagement with the field area. And gradually over a very long period of time, one is able to make observations which really have a ring to them in their relevance and in this case, their profundity. So thank you so much indeed. I'm delighted that we were able to record it. Well, yes, ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to put in your questions in the chat, or rather in the Q&A box. But just to start things off, Susan. I mean, for me, one of the things that I always try to think through carefully is the relationship between science and indigenous knowledge, which of course is relevant to all anthropologists. But it strikes me is that once we take climate change as being literally true, in fact, what we're doing is we're moving back from relativism almost entirely, and what we're doing is something which is actually a bit more sophisticated. We're saying that in fact the findings of science are not wrong at all, but they simply always have to be understood in a wider context. Even though that's so easy to say, if it does have the effect of meaning that we really can't anymore be relativists, it has quite strong implications for the way that we approach our discipline. And let me put it around the other way, just to be absolutely clear about that. I think it's very difficult for us to be both empiricists and relativists at the same time without actually thinking through that contradiction. Empirically, the world is getting warmer, and so we're agreeing with the scientists there completely. We're not saying that it's our impression the world is getting warmer. We're saying it's really getting warmer. There is a quite simple objective reality out there, which is pretty nasty. Anyway, I would be delighted to, if you would like to help us a little bit with thinking through these things.
Well, yes, the world is definitely getting warmer. One of the ways I like to think about it, and one of the ways I like to explain it too, because some people will say, well, but it snowed so much over there, so there must not be warming of the globe. I mean, it's important to understand that the warming overall of the atmosphere is coming into our climate system, and somebody said we should call it climate weirding, not climate change, because ecosystems are being affected more extremely. They're, my students, I give them this understanding that all ecosystems have ranges of hot and cold and ranges of wet and dry, and cultures have adapted to those ranges. They have a toolbox. They have things they can do. Sakha have things they can do when the wet cycle comes. They have ways to drain their hayfields. When the dry cycle comes, they have ways to retain moisture in their hayfields. Different cultures around the world have these different tools, but what climate change is doing is it's pushing those edges of hot and cold, of wet and dry out. So it's important, I think, to, yes, on a global level, things are getting warmer, but in the local, in this very ecosystem specific and maybe more importantly, culturally specific context, we need to talk in different ways. Does that make sense? You're muted, David. You're muted.
Yes, it makes complete sense. I mean, in a way, I think I looked at the website recently of the Max Planck Institute for, I think it's actually for climate change or weather and climate change in Germany, and talked to a researcher there. And to my astonishment, they only do science. They've got absolutely no sociological basis at all for anything that they do. So it seems that they must be doing one of two things. They must be either saying, well, people don't matter, which I can't believe for one moment they think, or they're kind of saying, well, it's not their job. What they're going to do is to produce the scientific models, and then they're handing it over to big, as it were, to big society. That the sort of thing that's just been meeting in so recently in Scotland. Yes.
Well, part of it, you know, first of all, academia continues to be extremely siloed, despite how much attention has been given to interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. I think, you know, it's hard to teach old dogs new tricks. When you're trained in a very siloed way, you have a hard time understanding how can I relate to these other ways of understanding the world. If we think of academia as a bunch of knowledge systems, for example. I mean, even though we developed this section of the first chapter of the special report on oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate as a framework, and the other chapters actually brought in Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge about their specific part of the cryosphere and the ocean. When push comes to shove, how do we actually do it, right? We can make visuals, we can talk our heads off about the importance of doing this, but how do we do this on the ground? And I think, you know, COP is a perfect example. There are many people, I mean, I believe that we need that kind of gathering and exchange of ideas and exchange of commitments, but I think all of us are wondering if is that it? It's sort of like, is that it? Is that all we're going to do? So then the question becomes, what do we do? How do we? And what I've come up with, I think in my mind is, you know, we've got to have a lot of these very local and regional based initiatives that work with local communities and bring them, you know, science, but also bring them and bring science in a context that can be used within the way they understand their world. And, you know, I want to move away also from this idea that these people just think this culture just thinks this one way about the world. No, there are scientists. Alexander Fyodorov himself is Sakha, and he's a permafrost scientist. The beauty of working with him is that he grew up in the region next to where I do my research and lived very much like the people in Algae and Kootenai live. So he has this deeper appreciation. I think that kind of scientific engagement is really critical, to have local people. But again, you know, this whole process of engaging or bringing Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge in concert with scientific knowledge, we're still working on it based on this sort of natural science idea that we're going to spit out some kind of a product in the end. We're going to have some kind of a deliverable. When in fact, in my mind, it's the process that's more important. It's the actual on the ground process that is going to, that's what is going to reap us the most benefits.
You mean the process of adaptation?
The process of engaging, like the knowledge exchanges that we did in 2010, where we brought Alexander Fyodorov's research. We had local people get up and talk about what they're observing based upon their intimate knowledge. We had Alexander Fyodorov bring the science to help understanding that these changes were due to something beyond the local people's control. It was this global change that's occurring, but it's those, so I guess we need a fleet of anthropologists who are going to go out there and find local, regional, native scientists who can work. I mean, that's one idea. But I'd love to hear what other people on the call think about, you know, ways we can do this. I'm sure there's some people on the call who also have experience in this.
Absolutely. Please just put your hand up if you would like to join in the conversation, and immediately.
So, David, there is a hand raised. It's
Splendid.
raised since a while by Satyabrata Sahu, so I'm not sure if they still want to speak, but I'm going to allow you to speak, Satyabrata, and you can say something if you still want to speak. Otherwise, just write in the chat your question if you prefer that. Let's see.
She has appeared. They have appeared.
Let's see.
Go
So you
ahead,
should
please.
be able to unmute yourself, Satyavrata, if you want to say something.
We can't hear you, Satyavrata. You need to unmute yourself.
It could be that they raised their hand accidentally because it's been up a while.
Oh, okay.
Not sure, but there's another raised hand as well. So maybe, well, Satyavrata, I'm going to lower your hand. And if you want to come back again, raise it again. We'll definitely allow you to speak. But in the meantime, we'll maybe go to Penelope Dranzer, who has also raised her hand.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Penny.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Please,
Okay.
please. You're online, as it were.
Because I can't see myself, but it's lovely to see you all. And Susie, it's wonderful to see you after a while.
You, Penny.
Been a while. I'm finding this absolutely fascinating, and I find the interesting the questions really interesting too. And I just would like you to ask you if you can enlarge on this what you were saying about metaphor, because metaphors are notoriously difficult to translate. That sometimes they can be not very compelling when you try and translate them. And as ethnographers, and I fully agree with you of the importance of being there on the ground and talking with people. We do that. We explore what people mean by their metaphors, and I just wondered, with your experience of talking with scientists, how are they receiving the metaphors that people use in local areas?
So which metaphors are you referring to?
Well, you actually said something about the, and that was a quote from an author called Kimmerer on goldenrod and asters and the yellow and the purple, and there's a color contrast there that seems to me to be, really rather intriguing in terms of weather patterns and how colors exist in people's lived experience. Mm-hmm. And how do scientists receive these sort of observations that people make?
Well, that's an excellent question. I really have not shared these with scientists. Although it's a great idea to do so. Robin Wall Kimmerer herself, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, talks about her own experience studying botany, and she shared this idea, I think, with her professor, and she was told she was crazy or something like that, but she went on to, pursue it nonetheless, and which speaks to, again, what we were talking about before, about the siloed nature of academia and the inability to understand integrating art and other visual expressions into a scientific understanding. So when you first started mentioning metaphor, I say, metaphorically speaking, we all live on permafrost. I would think some scientists would get that. The last quote I had up there from the IPCC report is basically saying that, we cannot turn a blind eye to what's happening to the cryosphere of the oceans because we are intimately dependent upon them. But in terms of sharing metaphors with scientists, I've not yet pursued that. Have you done any of that in your own work?
Well, in my own publications, yes, I've been exploring how people do use metaphors and how metaphors are profoundly significant for both, people with European languages as well as non-European languages. And we don't always give them as much, importance as I think we should. Some of them become so kind of commonplace that they're just part of everyday language, and people use them a bit unquestioningly. But as an anthropologist, I've tried to make that study more profound. But of course, that is not speaking with people, members of the scientific community. It's speaking amongst fellow anthropologists.
Yeah, I mean, the phenomenology, Tori Jennings has a chapter in our 2016 Anthropology and Climate Change, where she talks about her research in England, and she talks about Cornish weather and one local woman's description of the brassy light. And Tori could not understand what she was talking about, and the woman tried to use different descriptors for it. And then the next day, Tori was coming up the hill and she saw it, and she totally got it. So how do you give that experience to scientists? That's my question. How can we bring these metaphors and these deep, almost all sensory experiences that people have in place in their specific ecosystem? How can we bring that into science? That could be a rhetorical question.
Right, yes. Thank you for expanding on that.
Yes, and if you have anybody like to ask a question, continue with this theme, please do just put your hand up. Just whilst people are doing that, perhaps. So take our proverbial sort of postdoc researcher looking at weather patterns or something in a scientific institute. How would her or his work change if they suddenly started taking into account the sort of things that you're describing here? What do you think would actually happen to them?
Well, they might decide to become an anthropologist. Are you talking about somebody doing a social science, a natural science postdoc or something?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. Is there anything short of them converting to anthropology? I think that's the kind of question I'm asking.
Well, I mean, it would be a perfect incubator, I think, for doing exactly what we were talking about, which is finding new ways to talk about this in the natural science world.
Yes.
I think similar to the way we need to find ways to contextualize science based upon a culture's way of understanding their world so that they get what this is. I mean, you could go give an Al Gore talk to local communities, but it would do absolutely no good. So, that's what we were trying to do in the knowledge exchange process, was to bring things into a local context. But I think having ways to talk about this in science is also key. And again, I bet there's some people on this talk who have some experience here, so please don't be shy.
I think Andrea has her hand up, so go ahead.
Andrea has her hand up, exactly. Please, Andrea.
I see Amber, I don't see Andrea. Who is Andrea?
Yeah, let's see again. Andrea, do you want to ask a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a fantastic and inspiring talk as always. I just would like to add a comment, perhaps more than a question, about how to engage local members of the community, perhaps the students who are studying various disciplines. Their autoethnography could bridge these disciplinary and epistemological divides. At the conference, the Anthropology and Conservation, we presented a paper where students of the University of the South Pacific actually engaged in autoethnography of their experience of learning traditional navigation, and in this way re-engaging with the ocean, air, the sky, the motions. And that was a powerful way of engaging art, science, language, local knowledge, very deep history. And also I could see how the sense of agency gained a new way of expression. So autoethnography in other disciplines than anthropology could be a powerful way of bridging the local indigenous knowledge and scientific epistemologies. So I don't know what you think about this, Susan. Thank you.
Well, Andrea, please stay on because perhaps there are people on this call who aren't clear on what autoethnography is. Could you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, autoethnography is basically when someone is doing an ethnographic reflexive inquiry of her or his own thinking, relating to her or his own culture, and linking this experience with the existing literature, but in a way which is more of a genre of art fiction. So it's there is an overlap between autoethnography, fiction, autobiography, and obviously ethnography. And this makes autoethnography very unique, almost like a ecotone, if we use the ecological term, which is in between different ecosystems. And in this way, the ecosystems could be considered ocean and land, or you can have, but this is the most vivid one. I don't know whether you agree with this. You mentioned the word autoethnography, and you used it in, if I understood well, in your research.
Yeah, that was great. And I would love to know how to learn more about this project. But I also want to say that I think you kind of reminded me that I wanted to mention how important it is to engage youth. As Tracy, I think, mentioned, and I didn't have the opportunity to go into too much depth about the other changes that are occurring in these rural areas. But one of them, of course, is young people are leaving the rural areas. And I know that this is a phenomena that's occurring across the globe as young people become, more interested in things other than staying in the village, doing what their parents and grandparents did. But I think that finding ways to engage young people in what is going on in their rural locations is one of the ways to bring back an appreciation and an understanding of what is there. We've also done this with a mapping project where we had an intranet map, so a map that was shared within the community where one of the layers was elder knowledge, and young people who were very savvy with the computers would bring what the elders knew into this layer. And it was the kind of a situation where you could bring in recordings or short video clips of the elders, or etc., in different places across the landscape, sacred places, historical places, etc. But I like this idea too, because it brings it more into an academic framework. And I think, for example, the environmental humanities is an area that has really opened up in the last decade in terms of integrating all of these areas in a more formal academic way. That's a very promising area.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much. Any more questions from the participants, please? And or you can just write it in the Q&A if you would prefer.
So there is in the chat a comment from Tracy Hetherington,
Right.
who spoke to us earlier already, and I feel like Susan already addressed a lot of it, but I just read it out. So she says, Susie, you were terrific. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. As we discuss your book today, the COP26 meetings are going on in Glasgow. Given your previous experience with the IPCC, I wonder if you would like to comment.
Yeah, well, I did mention it, I guess. I tend to be an optimist. Hope springs eternal. I think it's important, especially in our kind of work. What we are hearing about the COP back here, you know, I mean, the headlines or the titles of the articles in the Washington Post, or what we hear on the news, you know, of course, is probably like the rest of the news we're hearing, negative. You know, oh, the leaders are all together, but there's more protesters, or, you know, they can't get anything done. You know, they come together, blah, blah, blah. I think, like I said before, I think COP is one of the ways that we can move forward. I don't think we should just solely depend upon COP. You know, making a commitment as a country to lowering greenhouse gases as a, you know, kind of true faith effort. It's a great thing, but I doubt that it is going to get us to where we need to be. We need much more. So I'm hoping that things are successful, quote unquote, whatever that means there. And, but there's so many moving parts. I think that's one thing about it. If you think about on a global scale, we've got countries like ours, the United States, Britain, of course, we've all developed based upon a fossil fuel economy. And we've got countries in the world that are still trying to get kind of to the standard of living that we have. So there's all kinds of issues about fairness and, you know, whose turn it is to, et cetera. So I will leave that to the people at COP. I've attended before. It's a very busy place. It's exciting. There's a lot going on. I think there were some commitments made in Paris, at the Paris COP. But like I said, I think the kind of work we're doing, we need much more of it. And we need more than COP. So that would be my comment. David, what do you think of COP?
Well, I'm still puzzling with the implementation of these vis-a-vis the indigenous peoples, and wondering quite how the two can be fitted together. So, so for example, among the Sakha, how do they express themselves outside their own community? How do they gain some kind of a transnational presence? Is this something that you help them with, for example? And what is the anthropologist's role in that, as a way, exteriorization of their predicament? Well,
The best way that I have done that is with the book and with my presentations. They certainly, Sakha are, I would say, somewhat unique among the other indigenous peoples of Russia, but they're a very large group. There are 450,000 Sakha, which is a relatively large group compared to other indigenous groups in Russia. They have a fair amount of standing, and there's all kinds of exciting, you know, academic work going on among Sakha academics and scientists, both social and natural scientists. all kinds of artistic expression. They're very much on the world stage. But in terms of permafrost thaw and the fires this summer, of course, I'm sure everybody knows about the huge fires in Siberia, which were mostly within the Sakha Republic. Sakha, and I talk about this in my book also, there's this quality of the Sakha character. It's called naril. Naril is the word. Sakha tend not to complain. They tend not to shout out about their predicament. They tend to persevere and persist to the extent they can. I mean, there were how many different videos I saw, YouTube and the like, this summer of these just unstoppable crews of Sakha going out to fight these fires. This incredible, dedication and passion that they had, and yet, they're not shouting it out to the world. I don't know how to say this any better, but it's part of their kind of constitution as a people.
Yep, no, I understand that. I understand that very well. And
Alexander Fyodorov has tried, sorry, I just remembered I wanted to say this too. Alexander Fyodorov has tried as best he can to help the head of the Republic, formerly called the president, no longer called the president, but the head of the Republic, to understand the issues with the permafrost. And just like so many other issues in climate change, there's this real friction between doing something about it and economic development.
yes.
The politicians are always fighting for this development. We've got to do this and we've got to do that. And the scientists and the people who understand the level of urgency to address the issues are trying to communicate. So his is a thankless job.
Exactly. I don't know what other colleagues think around the table, but my own specialist research area is Turkey, and there the dominant discourses throughout the population is one of development, absolutely dominant. And of course, people are a bit worried when they see they see something going wrong with the local community, but only in a very, very tiny way compared to the vast domination of the idea that everybody simply needs to continue this road of development and as quickly as you possibly can. So the destruction of the natural environment in Turkey is absolutely horrific in terms of its pace, completely horrifying, and there is no kickback whatsoever. So what can one do? We're faced with an expanding country of nearly 100 million people. Who are devoting their lives to expanding their use of natural environment and resources as quickly as they possibly can, and their justification would be just as you say, Susan. Well, you've had 300 years of developing. We've only had 100. So why can't we catch up a bit? 200 more years of development, and then we'll do what you're prepared to do. It's a very, very difficult, if not impossible, to work out how to bridge that one.
Yeah. That's sort of what I was getting at when I was talking about so many moving parts. We can have people at COP who are dedicated and have created these incredible plans of how each country can do this and that. But yet, if we've got these outliers like Turkey and Brazil and these other places that are just sort of undoing everything that the people at COP are trying to do, what's the point?
And India is another example. I mean, India, of course, is a fascinating, sophisticated, really superpower these days. But given that the average income in India is so small, that they presumably feel themselves fully justified to carrying on this development path until people hit something which is vaguely satisfactory, whenever that will be, and then they can implement all these measures. But they would say, well, we've got people living in the street in India on fractions, tiny fractions of the income you consume every day. So please don't lecture us.
Yeah, and then we can also talk about my country. So, but let's not.
Well, no, I wouldn't want to. We want to be optimistic, of course. Well, does anybody?
There is another sort of comment and question in the chat. So Tracy says,
in the chat or in the Q&A?
It's actually in the chat.
In the chat,
and there is something in the Q&A as well now.
Great,
okay.
Go ahead.
So maybe we'll go with that because I started speaking. So Tracy is back and asking, what's next, Susie? What are you continuing, or what are your new projects?
Well, first and foremost, I want to be able to go to Sakha. I haven't been on a plane since March 2020, and I feel so disconnected. And I do right now have a Fulbright Arctic Initiative Fellowship, which has been completely on Zoom for the last, I guess we started in January. So it's almost a year. We've just been completely on Zoom. All of us had proposed doing field work last summer. None of us could go and do that. So Fulbright Arctic Initiative is made up of a group. I would probably guess there's about 20 or so scholars, and we have all applied and proposed specific research, either doing some sort of comparison with field work we've done before, etc. I propose doing some comparative research in the Yukon, where permafrost is also going fast and also a huge threat to the indigenous communities in areas up there. And I set up an exchange with a scientist at the Yukon University. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I've got another contact that I'm hoping to work with on a larger permafrost and society project that's working in a pan-Arctic way. But the question is if I'm going to be able to get there. So, you know, I set myself up in this proposal to do 6 weeks in Canada and 6 weeks in Sakha, and to try to bring some kind of a comparative aspect to the research. So we'll see. Hopefully by summer, things will open up, but it's really, really hard to know about the COVID situation in Russia. We are in contact with people over there, of course, but it's really not clear what's going on. So continuing, that's, I guess, what is next, as much as well as I can continue.
Well, thank you. I have to let my son in, who's got back from school, but let me read out the question here. So Carol Maguire says, it seems that one Indigenous political alliance with such strong ecological mutual interest would be with Tibetan and other Himalayan peoples, considered the third pole. Is there a possibility of this happening, do you feel? And if Carol's here, she's welcome to expand on her question. I'm sure Henny can bring her to the fore.
Well, Carol, do you do research in Tibet? And if so, would you like to collaborate? Are you there? Do you want to come on and talk about this? It could be, I guess, that Carol just knows something about these communities at the third pole. For any of you on the call who don't know about the third pole, the Himalayas are considered the third pole. So we've got the North Pole, the South Pole, and the Himalayas. So I guess Carol's not going to participate, but yes, I think these kinds of exchanges are really fruitful. And oh, I see, she says she can't talk live. That's fine. No reason to apologize. But I think people-to-people exchanges like this of communities who are going through similar challenges are very productive and very fruitful, empowering, we could say. So yeah, that would be a great thing to consider. If you want to contact me, please do. I'd love to know more about it if you're engaged in that.
Could I ask you also something else whilst we have the pleasure of your company? Have you got any thoughts for all of us about the way that one can pursue very long-term fieldwork? I think this is an absolutely fascinating aspect of your project. So what from your experience should we talk to people who are thinking of this very long engagement?
Get married to a local person. No, I did actually do that, but you know, that was not a strategy that I consciously did. Yeah, I describe in the beginning of the book my whole movement up to this part of Siberia. Before I got there in 1991, in 88, 89, 90, I was working in southern Siberia. And I got invited to the International Jews Harp Conference in Yakutsk and decided to be brave and adventurous and went. And I describe how I left the gorgeous mountainous region of Lake Baikal and went up into the endless flatlands of Siberia. And well, they're both Siberia, but anyway. I guess my secret, I became completely mesmerized by the language, by the culture, by the understandings and the belief of the people that I was studying. So I think, you know, there's no silver bullet to doing it. I think passion is really important. And of course, you know, you can't do long-term field work if you're not accepted or able to do that in the community. So I think that part of it was having a sincere interest and fascination with how people had adapted to that environment, being sincerely interested in learning the language. I remember when I did my master's research studying the festival around the summer solstice in 1992, I did not know Sakha. I knew Russian, and so many times I'd be interviewing. Most of the elders didn't know Russian unless they had been in World War II, which meant a lot of the elders did not know Russian. So I'd have an interpreter, and the elder would be going on, and I couldn't wait to know what they were saying. And the interpreter would turn to me and say, "I don't know how to translate that." You know? Because if you're talking about a historical festival that goes back before the time even there was Russian contact with Sakha people, you know, you've got words that in order to explain what one word means, you almost have to say an entire sentence, right? So it's so culturally connected and intertwined. And it's also from a different language. It's a Turkic language. It's a completely different way of, you know, of constructing a language. So I went back the next year and learned it. And when I decided to go into the village and stay in the village to learn it for the immersion process, because in the city, not many people were speaking Sakha, there was too much Russian. People in the villages could not believe that I really wanted to learn their language. When they saw me, they would respond in Russian. And I would respond in Sakha as best I could and explain that I wanted to do Sakha. After a while, they got it. But I think, you know, being accepted into the communities and being, you know, trusted, you know, any ethnographic text that talks about how to do ethnography talks about how do you get into the field. You know people, you meet someone, you've got a trusted person who's going to bring you in. But having a sustaining reason to be there, that of course continually evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. My only opinion is that long-term fieldwork should be encouraged. I think the rewards get almost greater the longer one's there rather than less.
How long have you been in Turkey, David?
Doing my Turkish work since with this particular community since 1988.
Wow.
Yes. So And I even only now do I feel semi-comfortable with them. After how long is that? I mean, I feel that I can legitimately feel semi-confident with them. I mean, I really don't think a year is anything like enough, although one can learn an enormous amount, of course, in the first year that one's with the community. So I guess I would like to encourage everybody to stick it out, because it is really worthwhile to have such a long interaction. But let me not by any way wish to monopolize things. If people have a question, then please do. Please
don't be shy,
ask
people.
one. Absolutely. Otherwise, perhaps we should allow our speaker to continue with our way. So this really, I think, is your last chance to ask about the Sakha people today. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Oh, okay. She said Dr. Martin Mills is a social anthropologist specializing in Tibet. Yeah, okay. Well, I guess if there's nothing else, we could just remind people that the book will be available very soon. And I think that Haneen has put information in how to, excuse me, how to order the book, or she's going to send it to everybody, how to order the book.
I have put it in the chat twice already.
Oh, thank you.
With links for 3 different regions.
Great. And whoever's out there listening, thank you so much for coming, and please don't hesitate to let me know if I can do anything. I'm happy to share whatever I can. So I'm glad you came today. And again, I'm so grateful to the Royal Anthropological Institute, the British Museum, all of my collaborators on all of this work. Yeah.
Well,
thank you, David.
Indeed, and thank you, David. And I think the book really is a very important one. So I would encourage everybody to read it and order it for their university libraries. And I'm sure that the coming generations of students will get a great deal of benefit from it. So, well, thank you very much, everybody, then. And I wish you a very, very good night or good morning, wherever you are. And I look forward to the next occasion. And thank you so much, Susan. I'm afraid we can't really be together, but there we are, some virtual applause.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you to our audience. I'm going to close this event now.
All right. Goodbye.
Goodbye.